Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Computer Science Colloquium. Next week we'll hear from Dr. Cups.
Can't hear you.
Next week we'll hear from Dr. Cups, who is a prominent researcher at the Lawrence Livermore Laboratories, and she will tell us more about supercomputers. Today I have the distinct pleasure of introducing you to Kim Zetter, who is a senior writer in Wired magazine, and who wrote the definitive book on Stuxnet. Let's welcome our speaker.
I think it's the only book on Stuxnet. I don't have a very loud voice, so I hope you all can hear me, and I don't know if there's anyone behind that pillar. How many people have read the book, actually? Okay, so for the rest of you, hopefully this will be new. Stuxnet got a lot of attention when it first came out, but there's a lot that wasn't really revealed. And so I'm hoping that some of this, for those of you who've read, will be new. So I'm on the clock. He's timing me, so I'm just going to jump right into it. In June 2007, Hollywood released a movie which depicted their version of what cyber terrorism or cyber warfare might look like. And this is, I can't find my cursor. Yeah. Volume? We don't get any volume in this.
Is a country willing to pay for it?
FAA just issued a critical alert. The entire network went down.
Transportation system's crashing and they just hit the entire financial sector. You have no idea who you're dealing with. I'll take it.
Okay, so that's Hollywood's version of cyber terrorism. A few months earlier than this, there were a group of researchers at Idaho National Lab outside of Idaho Falls, and they were asking the question, they were wondering, we'd seen a lot of malware that obviously steals data, that takes over systems, but they were wondering if it was possible for a remote hacker in North Korea or China or Russia to cause physical destruction to equipment, that is, a leap from the digital realm to the physical realm, to cause physical destruction. Oh, this is advancing without me wanting it to. To cause physical destruction just with binary code. And so what they did was they wrote 21 lines of code, and they requisitioned a 27-ton generator that had been retired from the oil fields in Alaska. 21 lines of code, and what they targeted was something called a protective relay. The electric grid operates at 60 hertz, and protective relays are designed to detect anything that's connected to the grid, such as a generator or other equipment, has to be operating at that same level. And the protective relays are designed to detect if any equipment is getting out of sync and getting into a danger zone. And what happens then is the protective relay instructs the breaker to open up and disconnect that equipment so that it won't get damaged. So in this case, they wrote 21 lines of code to subvert the protective relays and fool the protective relays into thinking that an unsafe or an out-of-sync condition was actually normal. And so instead of opening the breaker and releasing a generator when it started to speed up, it would instruct the breakers to close. And what would happen in that case is the breaker opens up, the generator keeps spinning, and when the generator is connected to the internet, because the grid is going at 60 hertz, there's a push back on that generator. And when you open the breaker and there's no longer that push from the grid, the generator speeds up. And then if you close the breaker, the generator is actually going too fast for the grid. And what will happen is that energy has nowhere to go. And so it'll bounce back and it'll hit the generator. And so you'll see what happens here. The 21 lines of code were designed to open the breaker, let the generator speed up, close the breaker when it was out of sync, open the breaker, let it speed up more, close the breaker. And so you'll see what happens. So that attack took 3 minutes to accomplish, to basically kill the generator. It could have happened in a much smaller amount of time. They had some built-in pauses so that the people monitoring the safety mechanisms would be able to check throughout the test to make sure that everything was okay, and then they would proceed with the test. So that was in March 2007. The Aurora generator test is what it was called. We know that during that period, Stuxnet had already been created, and it may have already been launched. We have evidence that Stuxnet was in the wild at least by November 2007. A sample of it had been uploaded to a website for testing. And so we also know that sometime in 2006, President Bush's advisors had come to him with a plan to subvert Iran's uranium enrichment program with a digital attack. So sometime between early to mid 2006 to late 2007, the Stuxnet code was created. It's running when I don't want it to. Okay, so let's go back though. That was 2007. I want to go back to 1993. There was a RAND article that was published that coined the term cyber warfare for the first time. And in that article, they were talking about an innovation in warfare that they anticipated would be the 21st century's equivalent of the Blitzkrieg. And what they were talking about was not necessarily the kind of warfare that would overtake conventional warfare, but something that would be used as an adjunct to warfare, or possibly as a precursor to prevent warfare. And that's exactly what Stuxnet was aimed at doing. We have the US developing its first cyber warfare around that time. The first cyber division was developed by the Air Force in 1993. Initially that was for defense. And around that time, in 1995, Time caught on to what was happening. And they published this cover story about cyber warfare with the tagline, "The US rushes to turn computers into tomorrow's weapons of destruction. But how vulnerable is the home front?" So obviously people were already considering offensive attacks, but at the same time the question was being asked, well, if we're getting ready to launch digital attacks against our adversaries, how vulnerable are our own systems to the same kinds of attacks? Obviously those questions were being asked, but no one bothered to answer them or do anything about them. In 1997, we have the first signs of the NSA developing offensive attacks. The Secretary of Defense at that point gave the NSA authority to begin research into offensive attacks. Obviously, there were advantages to offensive cyber warfare. There was a low cost of entry for conducting such campaigns. You didn't need a lot of troops, you didn't need a lot of weaponry. There was a flexible base of deployment, meaning that you didn't have to be geographically close to your target, you could attack them remotely. And there was a diverse and ever-expanding set of targets, meaning that a lot more systems were being connected to the internet at that time. And in particular, critical infrastructure systems, industrial control systems were being connected. This information, this description here is coming actually from a declassified NSA document where they were talking about the advantages during that period, 1996, 1997, of beginning to think about offensive operations. Anyways, so the NSA started to build a roadmap of technologies, and they were attending hacker conferences like DEF CON in Las Vegas, the Hope Conference, and they were trying to amass information about vulnerabilities in systems and also collect kinds of tools that were already available, viruses, worms, Trojan horses, and they were looking at stockpiling vulnerabilities in software systems to be able to attack them. So that's around 1997. So let's jump ahead to 2000. Around 2000, the Iranians began to secretly construct a uranium enrichment plant outside of a village called Natanz. It's about 200 miles south of Tehran. And a couple of years later, in August 2002, there was a group of Iranian dissidents who convened a press conference in Washington, D.C., and they exposed this covert operation. And they were talking about a uranium enrichment plant that actually they didn't know it was a uranium enrichment plant. They knew that it was a covert nuclear operation, but they didn't know exactly what it was. So there was a group in DC that decided to search for satellite images of this and see if they could uncover what this was. This is one of those satellite images. And the image was taken about a month after that conference. And you can see the two buildings in the upper right-hand corner are the centrifuge halls. This is where the uranium enrichment is being conducted. And at the time that this picture was captured, the Iranians were in the middle of burying the two halls. So you can see the brown and the gray. They were layering layers of cement and dirt on top of it to protect it from a possible airstrike. So the timing of this exposure was very strategic. It was intended to inform the public about this. The CIA already knew about the operation, but it was intended to, in a way, strategically expose the operation to the public, capture images that could be shown on CNN at a time when the buildings were still visible. Because a couple of months later, this is what it looked like. They were completely covered. So the exposure was very strategic, and it allowed also the International Atomic Energy Agency, which is the UN body that monitors nuclear programs around the world, it allowed the IAEA to demand that Iran let their inspectors in. So what happened was the inspectors visited Natanz for the first time in February 2003. So I'll give you a bit of a timeline from there. So it's exposed in August 2002. The IAEA inspectors are taken out to Natanz for the first time in February 2003, and they're very concerned because they see that the program is more advanced than they were expecting it to see. Iran already had the centrifuge halls built. They didn't have any centrifuges in there yet, but they had a pilot plant in which they already had some centrifuges installed. And the pilot plant was designed to sort of test the uranium enrichment process, make sure it was okay, and then they would begin installing centrifuges in the underground halls. So Iran was insisting that its nuclear program was completely peaceful. It was meant for nuclear power and not for nuclear weapons, and that they had a national right to nuclear energy. But the West wasn't convinced. And so between 2003, that first visit, and 2004, the West was trying to convince Iran to halt its program until the IAEA could get more information about when it had begun and how far along it was. The concern was how far along, how advanced was the program, and how long would it be before Iran had enough enriched uranium to produce a nuclear bomb. So Iran, during that period, agreed to a voluntary suspension of its uranium enrichment program. They agreed to 2 different suspensions on 2 different points. But what happened in September 2005, shortly after Mahmoud Ahmadinejad was elected president of Iran, he had been the mayor of Tehran until then, Iran decided it had had enough of these negotiations, and it announced that it was proceeding with its uranium enrichment program. So it withdraws from the suspension agreement, and in February 2006, Iran announces that it's going to begin its first enrichment of uranium in the pilot plant. We see, though, that in February 2006, that same month, something that we learned later is that 50 of those centrifuges in the pilot plant exploded. So we see this first evidence of sabotage. Don't believe it was Stuxnet. No one knew what had happened until a year later, an Iranian official was giving a television interview, and he described what occurred. He said that they had installed these centrifuges in the pilot plant, and for about 10 days they operated fine, and then suddenly they started exploding. And they couldn't figure out what was going on, but eventually they determined that what had happened was that someone had sabotaged UPS, a universal power supply that Iran had obtained from Turkey. And these UPSs were sabotaged to cause the centrifuges to spin out of control. So we see the first sabotage there. So Iran is having a lot of problems here, getting up and running. But over that year, throughout 2006, it succeeds to master those problems. And in February 2007, Iran announces that it's going to begin installing centrifuges for the first time in those underground halls. So the first centrifuges are installed in February 2007. By June, they already have 1,400 of those installed. Let's jump forward a year. April 2008, they've doubled that number, 3,000 centrifuges. And Israel, of course, is in a panic. And they're trying to convince the U.S. to engage in an airstrike to ruin the plant, to bomb the plant. And they're predicting that if Iran isn't stopped, they will have enough low-enriched uranium, LEU, to produce a weapon by the year 2010. Low-enriched uranium is a low level of enriched uranium, about 3.5%. For a bomb, you need about 90%. But if you have that low-enriched uranium as a stockpile, once you make that decision to produce a bomb, you can further enrich it fairly quickly. So that's the concern that they have, that there's now stockpiling this low-enriched uranium. So let's jump to November 2009. Iran has 8,000 centrifuges installed in one of the halls, Hall A. They're called Hall A and Hall B. They have 8,700 installed. They're enriching uranium, and Iran is moving very quickly towards having enough material for a nuclear bomb. But the month later, the IAEA inspectors who visited Natanz about twice a month on average started noticing that the technicians there were removing centrifuges from the hall, and they didn't know why. Now, the type of centrifuges that Iran has, they're called IR-1s, and they're patterned after a Pakistani centrifuge called PLP-1. These are first-generation centrifuges that are prone to break. They're not really well designed. So ordinarily, it would be no surprise that Iran would decommission about 10% of the centrifuges over the course of a year. But if Iran had 8,700 installed in November 2009, there wouldn't be any surprise if they decommissioned 800 over a year. But what the inspectors noticed was that over just a period of a couple of months, they were actually taking out and removing between 1,000 and 2,000 centrifuges. Again, they had no idea what was going on. Physically or visibly, there was nothing to indicate. This is going to drive me crazy. Okay, so what happens? The Iranian technicians obviously didn't know what was going on. The IAEA inspectors didn't know what was going on. But 6 months later, something that seemed to be completely unconnected to this occurred. And what happened was that some computers in Iran started crashing. And they were crashing uncontrollably. They would go into a blue screen of death and reboot, and no matter what the administrators did, they couldn't control the machines. They would wipe the operating system, try to start over with a new version of operating system, and they would have the same problems. So they contacted the maker of their antivirus system, a small company in Belarus called Virus Blockada. This is their office. And some analysts there got permission to remotely access some of the machines that were crashing. This guy, Sergei Ulesin, was one of the analysts. And they reached out to a couple of the machines in Iran, and they found some software or some files that they thought were malicious. And as they examined them, they discovered that one of the files was a zero-day exploit. And zero-day exploits are security holes in software that the maker of the software doesn't know about. And because the maker of the software doesn't know about it, there's no patch that can keep attackers out. And because it's a zero-day vulnerability that no one knows about it, it means antivirus companies also don't know about it. So there are no signatures in antivirus scanners in order to detect malicious code that will attack that vulnerability. But this was a really interesting zero-day that they discovered. This was a zero-day vulnerability that was so ubiquitous in the Windows operating system that it affected 7 versions of the operating system going back all the way to the year 2000. That meant that millions of machines were vulnerable to this vulnerability. And the exploit that they found attacking it was a worm. And a worm can travel automatically without, the difference between a worm and a virus needs some kind of action from the user, clicking on a file or something like that. A worm will travel automatically. It needs no user involvement. And this was traveling rapidly. They were already seeing it traveling on systems. An exploit is used to install other malware, and they were already seeing that this exploit was dropping malware on systems throughout the Middle East. And it started dropping on malware on systems who are customers of Virus Blockada outside the Middle East. So Virus Blockada contacted Microsoft to notify them of it so Microsoft could begin preparing a patch. But the files that were being dropped on the systems were extremely complicated, and they were encrypted, and they were very complex. And Virus Blockada didn't have the experience to examine them. So they made the files available to other researchers. And some of those researchers were at Symantec. Liam Omerku, Eric Chin, and Nico Follier. So they picked up the code, and they started examining it. And what they discovered was that what was dropped on the systems had 2 portions. Just like a conventional weapon has 2 parts, the missile that delivers the weapon and the payload, which is the explosive part. A digital weapon is the same. It needs a carrier, which are the zero-day exploits, to spread it onto systems. And then I'm sorry, I just can't. I can't stop this. And then the payload itself. In this case, Stuxnet had 7 ways to spread. It turns out that the researchers discovered that it had not just 1 zero-day exploit, it used 5 zero-day exploits, which was completely unprecedented. And by that time, when they discovered those zero-day exploits, they knew that this was a nation-state attack, because zero-day exploits are very not time sensitive, sorry, the time involved to find a zero-day vulnerability and to develop a workable exploit for them. So it takes a lot of resources, and using 5 zero-day exploits, if you're willing to burn 5 zero-day exploits in a single attack, you've got a lot of resources. So they knew that this was a nation-state attack, but they didn't know what it was doing. But anyways, and I hope that some of you can read the red. I know it looks a little... but anyways, it had 7 ways of spreading, not just through the zero-day exploits. It also spread through Siemens Step 7 project files. And I'll get to that in a second when we get to the payload. So we look at the payload. Stuxnet would infect any Windows system and drop its files, but it would only unleash its payload on a system that had a very specific configuration. And so Stuxnet was looking, once it got on a system, it was looking for the presence of Siemens Step 7 WinCC control software. And this is an industrial control system software. And the Step 7 software is used to program a Siemens component called a programmable logic controller, or a PLC. And the WinCC software is used on monitoring stations to monitor whatever equipment or operation the PLC is controlling. So Stuxnet would look for the presence of that software, and then it would look for the presence of 2 brands of Siemens PLCs. One is called the S7-315 PLC, and the other is the S7-417 PLC. The 417 PLC is a Siemens high-end PLC. It costs about $10,000, and the 315 it costs about $1,500. So Stuxnet this is a programmable logic controller. This is what it looks like, and these are ubiquitous in critical infrastructure. They control dams. They open and close dams. They are installed in electric grids, power plants. They're installed in water treatment plants, in chemical plants. They control the flow of the movement of elevators. They control traffic lights. They control a lot, but they were never built with security in mind. So they have a lot of vulnerabilities, and Stuxnet was exploiting those vulnerabilities. So what the researchers discovered was that Stuxnet didn't have just one payload. It actually had 2 payloads, which surprised them. And so those 2 payloads occurred in 2 different versions of Stuxnet. Now, I'll read this out for you, those of you who can't see it. We had a Stuxnet 1.0 was the version that Virus Blockade had discovered in June 2010. And that version was the version that had 2 payloads in it. It had one that was designed to target the 315 PLC, the low-end PLC of Siemens, and one that was designed to target the high-end 417 PLC. But that attack code in that version of Stuxnet was mysteriously disabled. Not all of it was there. And so the researchers were unable to reverse engineer it completely in order to figure out what exactly it was doing. Again, at this point, they don't know what it's attacking. They have no idea that it's connected to the Iran's uranium enrichment program. They're not even sure that Iran is the target, but they suspect that Iran was the target. So what happened then was, 2 years later, long after they had already reverse engineered this first version, Symantec discovered an early version of Stuxnet, Stuxnet 0.5. And that version, which was the version that I told you we saw evidence of being unleashed in November 2007, that version, oh, thanks, can you see that better? That version attacked the 417 PLC and was the code that had been mysteriously disabled in the later version. But in this early version, it was fully enabled. So that gave the researchers the ability now to fully reverse engineer that and figure out what that version was doing. So, okay, so that version was launched late 2007, ran through 2008 at the Natanz plant, and that version targeted valves. It was a 417 PLC that was controlling valves on the centrifuges. So the centrifuges are configured in what's called a cascade, and uranium hexafluoride gas is pumped into the centrifuges at one level of cascade. You might have 20 centrifuges on that initial level of cascade. It's pumped in through one of those pipes at the top, and there are valves at the end. Uranium hexafluoride gas is pumped into the centrifuges, spins at supersonic speed. There's a rotor inside that separates the isotopes inside to separate out the isotopes that you need for nuclear fission and the isotopes that you don't need. So the enriched uranium that it separates goes out through one of the other pipes into a second set of centrifuges in the cascade to be further enriched. It's a little like panning for gold. And it gets further enriched through each stage of the cascade until you get the level of enrichment that you want. The third pipe is for the depleted uranium or the waste to go out to a second set of centrifuges. So what Stuxnet was doing was it would infect that 417 PLC, and it would sit there for 30 days, not doing anything visible. Instead, it was recording the normal operation of whatever these PLCs were controlling, and it was collecting data and storing it. And at the end of those 30 days, the sabotage began. It would start to close some of the exit valves on these centrifuges. And what happened then was that uranium hexafluoride gas would pump into the centrifuges, but it wouldn't be able to get out. And it would keep those valves closed for either a period of 2 hours or until the pressure inside the centrifuges increased 5 times. And at the end of that period, either the pressure increased or the 2 hours, it would go back to normal activity. But during that sabotage period of 2 hours, Stuxnet then was feeding false information back to the monitoring systems. It was feeding back that data that it had spent 30 days recording, so that the technicians looking at their monitors would have seen the centrifuges acting completely normally, and they wouldn't have noticed what was happening. So the attack would go through that pattern, and at the end of that initial sabotage, it would start over again, rinse and repeat. 30 days collecting more data, sabotage would begin again. What this told us was that the attackers were not looking for all-out destruction, but they were looking for incremental destruction over a period of time, and they wanted to do it instead of destroying a lot of centrifuges at once, which would have been really noticeable. They wanted to do it over a period of time and in a randomized way, so that technicians wouldn't be able to anticipate which centrifuges would be having problems. The valves, some of the valves, the actual valves, the number of the valves that they were closing were actually coded into the code, and some of them were chosen randomly by Stuxnet. So the consequences of that is that when the pressure increases, the gas pressure increases inside the centrifuge, the gas starts to solidify. And when the gas solidifies, it catches on that rotor that's spinning at supersonic speed inside. And so what happens is that rotor gets a little off balance, and it starts hitting the inside of the centrifuge, and it causes the centrifuge to start to wobble. The centrifuge is precariously balanced on the top of a pin, and it has some ball bearings, and it's spinning like this. And so any movement that throws it off balance is going to unmoor it from that pin and can cause it to crash into the centrifuges that are around it. But what's also happening here is that they're wasting gas. So the gas inside the centrifuge, ordinarily the cascades have a safety mechanism on them. And when it detects that safety mechanism, like the protective relay on that electric grid, when it detects that a centrifuge is getting into an unsafe condition, it will close down and isolate that centrifuge and stop and keep the gas there so that the hot gas can't spread and destroy anything else, and so it won't be lost. But Stuxnet, during that period that it was sabotaging, I talked about that it was feeding false data back to the operators. It also disabled that safety system. So that safety system couldn't detect when the centrifuges were getting into an unsafe condition, and so you couldn't preserve the gas. So gas was getting wasted and centrifuges were getting destroyed. So what's the evidence that we have of this? We see that the first centrifuges were installed, as I said, in February 2007. Iran had planned to install 3,000 by that May, but that didn't happen. By August, they had only 1,900 installed, and it took until the end of November to install the rest. So they were clearly having some problems, and they didn't know what they were. We also noticed that based on the amount of uranium hexafluoride gas that the Iranians were feeding into the cascades, they should have been able to produce 124 kilograms of enriched uranium at the end of that year. Instead, they got only half that amount, 75 kilograms. So they were losing it. They were losing it because the centrifuges were crashing. So what's happening now? We're coming into 2009. We've had an election, and the administration is changing. Stuxnet was a covert operation, and as a covert operation, it requires an authorization by a sitting president in a presidential finding. And because that administration, the presidential finding that Bush had signed was coming to an end with his administration, the covert operation had to be reauthorized. So in January 2009, before Obama takes office, he meets with President Bush, and they do the handoff on all the important information that Obama needs to know. And Bush describes this program, this covert operation against Iran called Olympic Games. And he tells them that it's succeeding, but they need more time to have it be more successful. And so he urges Obama to reauthorize the program, and Obama does. But not only does Obama reauthorize, he authorizes a next version of Stuxnet that's actually going to be a little more aggressive than that first version. So in June 2009, Stuxnet 1.0 is launched, and that same version gets launched again in April 2010. And we know that at least 2 more rounds of Stuxnet were launched, possibly after that. Now, in this case, the payload, between June 2009 and April 2010, the payload was different from the first version that had been launched. But between these 3 here, the payload remained the same, but the missile portion, the way that they delivered it, was the only thing that changed. So what did this version, Stuxnet 1.0, do? Instead of targeting the valves on the centrifuges and cascades, this one targeted a 315 PLC that was controlling frequency converters. Frequency converters are very similar to the UPS, the Universal Power Supply. And they control the speed that the centrifuges are spinning. And so what it did, it would sit, very similar to the other attack, it would sit on that PLC, that 315 PLC, for 13 days initially. And it would record the normal operations of that PLC and whatever equipment they were controlling. And then at the end of that 13 days, the sabotage would begin. It would first increase the frequency, spinning those centrifuges to 1,410 hertz for 15 minutes. This is close to the maximum speed that these centrifuges can withstand before they start to deteriorate. And at the end of that 15 minutes, it would reduce the speed to 1,064 hertz. We believe that 1,064 hertz was the normal operating speed of those centrifuges. After 26 days, a second round of attack would kick in, and this time, instead of increasing, they would slow the speed of the centrifuges to 2 hertz for 50 minutes. And at the end of that period, they would restore it to the normal operation. And again, like the first attack, while that sabotage was going on, they would feed back the false data to the operators that they had recorded during those first 13 days. And they would disable the safety system. So after 26 days then, it would sit there. This time, instead of 13 days of recording normal operations, the second round it would sit for 26 days recording normal operations, and then the sequence would begin again. So again, this was circular sabotage over and over again. So what are the consequences of that? Like the first attack, the centrifuges are going to spin out of control, and they'll become unmoored and crash into each other. The centrifuges disintegrate inside. They don't necessarily disintegrate outside. Some of them may split open, but this was one of the reasons why the IAEA inspectors looking at the centrifuges couldn't tell what was happening. What was happening was that the rotors inside were deteriorating. And then we've got the uranium hexafluoride gas again being lost. And what is the evidence of these effects? So in June 2009, Iran had 12 cascades installed in that underground hall, Hall A. And they were installed in what was called Module A26. Iran had that hall divided into centrifuge rooms, and each one was called a module. And they had a Module 24, or Module A24, Module A26, and Module A28. And this particular module had 12 cascades. One cascade, that's the configuration that I described that holds multiple centrifuges. In Iran, one cascade holds 164 centrifuges. They had 12 cascades that were running and enriching gas. And 6 were under vacuum but not enriching yet. The process is you install a centrifuge, you start the motor, it starts spinning, and you put it under vacuum in order to take the air out and try and get any dust out. And then once it reaches the acceptable point, you start feeding the gas in. So they had 6 that they were being prepared to receive gas. Stuxnet was launched, that version of Stuxnet was launched in June 2009. August 2009, we see that they've dropped 2 cascades that are no longer enriching gas. They've pulled the gas out of 2 cascades, and now instead of 6 being under vacuum without gas in them, we have 8. So they've removed 2 cascades worth of centrifuges, about 300 centrifuges, and they're just sitting there now, spinning but no gas in them. And if you go a few months later, November 2009, and that's dropped down further. Now only 6 cascades are enriching, and they've moved, they now have 12 under vacuum. And the next month, of course, is when the IAEA inspectors started noticing the technicians actually removing centrifuges. So what's happening in this period, they're having problems, they don't know what's happening, but they're not removing the centrifuges yet. They're letting them sit there, they're trying to examine them, they take the gas out. December 2009, they give up, and they start removing centrifuges, between 1,000 and 2,000. So obviously, the Iranians couldn't figure out what was going on. They couldn't pinpoint what the source of the problem was. They assumed it was material defects or something else, but they didn't really know. So how did Stuxnet get caught? As I said, Stuxnet had been unleashed, the first version in 2007, but it hadn't been discovered until 2010. So what happened after those 3 years to get it caught? The first version of Stuxnet had only one way to spread, and this is Stuxnet 0.5 that was unleashed in 2007. It had only one way of spreading, and that was via Step 7 project files. The Step 7 project files are the files that are used to program a Siemens PLC. And so what they would do is, it had a way of infecting a USB stick, and the programmers, the Siemens programmers at Natanz, would put their commands on a USB stick. They would create it on a desktop computer, put it on a USB stick, walk it down to the production network, and install it on the PLCs that way. But those Step 7 project files were infected with that version of Stuxnet, and that's how Stuxnet got on the first time. What that tells us, because it had only one way of spreading, is that the attackers had close access to the targeted machines. They either had an insider helping them, or they had some way of getting the attack close to those machines. But that changed in 2009. In 2009, they appeared to have lost that access, and so they started adding spreading mechanisms. And the spreading mechanisms then allowed them, that we see that the targets then were no longer machines at Natanz, but they started targeting 5 companies outside of Natanz. Symantec referred to them as domain A, company B, company C, company D, and E. So in June 2009, we see that 4 companies are hit and infected, company A, B, C, and D. The next wave of attack is in March 2010, and only company B is hit this time. And then a month later, we see the 3rd attack, and this time A, E, and B. Company B is the only one that was hit all 3 times. So why are this is important? These companies make industrial control systems, or they install industrial control systems in Iran. They're all Iranian companies. First one, company A, is Foulad Technique. The second one, which is the one that got hit in all 3 waves, is called Bepaju. The third one is Nida Industrial Group. The 4th one we know only as CGJ, but we believe it's Control Ghostar Jahed. And the 5th one, Kala Electric. It also goes under our name Kalai Electric. Kalai is very interesting because Kalai used to be a watch factory in Tehran. And around 1999, the Iranians converted it into a secret uranium manufacturing plant. And Kala served as a front company for buying equipment secretly for Natanz. A couple of these companies have been named in U.S. lawsuits for illegal proliferation activity. And so how do we know these companies? So these companies weren't chosen randomly. They installed centrifuges. Some of them installed centrifuges at Natanz, but they all, sorry, not centrifuges, industrial control systems, including the Siemens systems. But not just at Natanz, they install industrial control systems like the Siemens systems in pipelines in Iran, at chemical plants, and other facilities. So infecting these companies would give the attackers not only the ability to get malware onto the uranium enrichment plant, but onto any other customer that these guys might be using. So how do we know the identity of these companies? So because the attackers lost that close access from that first version, they put a log file into the later versions. They were far removed now from Natanz. They were hoping that contractors at these companies would carry the malware into them. These are the 5 companies. They were hoping that the contractors would carry the malware on a USB stick into them for them. But they didn't know how that would happen or when that would happen. So they put a log file in Stuxnet that would record every machine that Stuxnet infected. Because Stuxnet was a worm, it would travel. And each time Stuxnet infected another machine, it would record some information in this log file. It would record the IP address, it would record the internal timestamp of that computer, the date and time. It would record the username of that machine, and it would record the domain. And the domain, in some cases, identified the name of the company. In this case, you can see Bepaju there. But it would also record whether or not Stuxnet had found the presence of Siemens Step 7 software and a PLC on it. And you can see in the bottom right-hand corner there, they struck pay dirt at Bepaju because there's a PLC showing up in the configuration. So this log file would tell every time Stuxnet infected a machine, it would report back to a command and control server. The attackers would be able to remotely track Stuxnet as it was going, and they would be able to see where it was traveling to and ultimately if it was reaching its target. But because they had put that log file in there, it meant that the researchers could also access it, parse it, and this is what it looked like when they parsed the data, and they could trace it back as like breadcrumbs to see what were the first machines that ever got infected. So what happened was, because the attackers now attacked outside of Natanz, attacked contractors, and they didn't try and control it or couldn't control it, it started to spread. And the March 2010 version was the version that got it caught. March 2010, only Bepaju got hit. And you can see in that center, that starburst, are all of the infections traveling through Bepaju's computers. Bepaju had offices in London and Malaysia. And so we see it jumping from computers in Iran to colleagues' computers and customers' computers in Europe and Malaysia. And within a month in April, it had already arrived to machines in Australia. So within a few months, Stuxnet had infected more than 100,000 machines. Most of them were in Iran, but it started spreading further. Because Stuxnet is a worm can't be controlled, and it will continue to travel and infect a machine as long as there's another machine out there that's infected and that's connected to the internet. Today, Kaspersky has tracked more than 3 million infections of Stuxnet. So even though it's not harming machines that are not its target, it's still infecting them, and it can still have an effect on those machines because it's a worm. It's going to keep traveling back each time you clean that machine and reinfect it over again, and it takes up a lot of resources inside the machine. So it does have an effect on the machine. So I want to go back to that timeline that I showed you earlier. I know that you can't read this, so I'll read it out for you. Between 2003 and 2005 was that period when Natanz was exposed, and the West was trying to get Iran to halt its nuclear enrichment program. In the midst of that period, in 2004, the US got its hands on samples of those centrifuges that were being used at Iran. They got them because Iran had purchased the design for its centrifuges from a Pakistani called A.Q. Khan. And A.Q. Khan had also sold the design to Libya. And Libya was in the process of building its own covert uranium enrichment program. And the CIA had infiltrated A.Q. Khan's supply network, discovered a shipment that was being sent to Libya, and intercepted it, and exposed Libya's covert operation. Libya had to come clean on it and announce that they would end the program. And the IAEA was sent to Libya to start to catalog all of the equipment that was there. And that equipment was eventually shipped off to a lab in the US called the Oak Ridge National Lab in Tennessee. And once it was there, authorities there began to build a covert plant of centrifuges and cascades, modeling the Natanz plant in order to figure out how to attack it. These are the centrifuges at Oak Ridge. So during that period, 2004, they're starting to examine and put together these centrifuges and figure out vulnerabilities that can be used to ruin them. We also see that in 2005, I know you can't read this at all, the first version of Stuxnet 0.5, we see some evidence of its creation, or the beginning stages of it. The attackers registered a command and control server in, it was around November 2005 when they registered it. So Stuxnet wouldn't have been unleashed in 2005 because, again, the centrifuges weren't installed at Natanz until 2007, but they would have been using this command and control server for reconnaissance. They would have been using it to send malware to the Iranian systems to collect information about the configuration that they could then use to design Stuxnet. So that's 2005. 2006, remember, Iran withdraws from the suspension agreement, begins enriching uranium at the pilot plant for the first time. 2006, also Bush's advisors proposed the digital operation. And in 2007, around 2006, 2007, Stuxnet code is written. And as Iran is installing the centrifuges for the first time in the underground hall in 2007, we see evidence that Stuxnet is being released. So, and then the attack versions. So, did Stuxnet succeed? What we see is that there was a decline in Iran's uranium enrichment output during that period, but by the end of 2010, they had recovered, and they had actually sped up their uranium enrichment process. And so, although it had slowed the process, Stuxnet had been discovered prematurely, and had it been left on its own, there would have been more effects. But ultimately, it didn't have a huge effect. There were officials in the U.S. and Israel who claimed that it set the uranium enrichment program back 3 years. It's unclear if that's really the success it had. So what were the mistakes? Obviously, getting caught was the biggest mistake. In 500 kilobytes of code, there was just one bug, one programming error, which is remarkable. And that error was in what's called the print spooler exploit. The print spooler exploit was one of the 5 zero-day exploits. And what happened was when Stuxnet would find a new machine to infect, it would examine the machine to see if there was an older version of Stuxnet on it. And if there was an older version, it would replace that version with the latest version of itself, replace all the files. But there was a bug in this print spooler exploit, and instead of replacing that file, it would append itself to the file that was already on Stuxnet. Because Stuxnet was a worm, it would travel through networked systems and hit the same system over and over and over again. And each time it hit a system that already had Stuxnet on it, instead of replacing that principal or exploit, it would add to it. And that file kept growing and growing and growing. And you can see on administrator forums, administrators are talking about it. They're saying, I have this file on my system, it keeps growing, can someone help me? I don't know what it is. So the other problem, of course, was this incompatibility issue that caused the blue screens of death on those machines in Iran that got Stuxnet caught. We don't know what that incompatibility was. Researchers have tried to redo experiment to try and see what might have caused it. They think it might have been Virus Blockade's antivirus program. The attackers had actually tested Stuxnet against multiple versions of antivirus products just to make sure that their attack wouldn't get caught, and they may have overlooked Virus Blockade's antivirus software. The other problem, of course, was adding those 0 days. They supersized Stuxnet in March 2010, and that's, of course, caused uncontrollable spreading. Final mistake, of course, was the failure to kill the code. Each time Stuxnet was reporting back to those command and control servers, the attackers would have seen that Stuxnet was getting out of control. They would have seen it reporting from IP addresses in Australia and Europe, and they would have known that it was outside of Iran. And they could have reached out and killed the code and stopped it spreading, or at least controlled us to a certain extent, and they didn't. So why didn't they? The answer might be what occurred in late 2010. Symantec took 4 months to reverse engineer the code. And during that time, there were sort of incremental reports, but no one knew exactly the full story of what Stuxnet was affecting. But in November 2010, Symantec finally realized that it was affecting the frequency converters and that it could only be affecting one plant, and that is the Natanz plant in Iran. And they published a report talking about it infecting these frequency converters. And shortly after that report came out, Iran shut down the Natanz plant completely. For 6 days, all the centrifuges were taken offline, computers were stopped, and they would have been searching through the systems to try and root out Stuxnet. But also, right after Symantec published that report, all of the machines that were infected with Stuxnet, that were reporting back to the command and control server, stopped communicating. So when Symantec had first gotten hold of Stuxnet, they actually sinkholed the command and control servers. By sinkholing, what they mean is they redirected traffic. Any communication that would have been coming from a machine that was infected with Stuxnet was communicating with the attacker's command and control server. Symantec got that redirected to a server that they controlled, so that these machines would start reporting to them. And so they could see every machine that was infected. And a lot of machines from Iran were reporting into them. But after they published their report that confirmed that this was attacking Natanz and it was attacking Iran, someone in Iran in the government shut down the external firewalls. And so no communication could come out. And so why did they do that? They knew that even if Stuxnet wasn't affecting any machine except the ones at Natanz, it was infecting them but wasn't affecting them. They knew that simply having Stuxnet on any machine gave the attackers a backdoor into that machine. So every machine, 3 million machines that Stuxnet would have spread to, would have given the attackers a backdoor to those systems to potentially spy on those systems, to gather more malware, whatever. And the Iranians recognized that and shut down. So that may be why the attackers didn't try and halt it. So obviously there are many advantages to digital weapons. They can save lives and prevent war. That was the aim of this, in this case, to avoid an airstrike. If done right, they cause no collateral damage. Stuxnet was a precision weapon. It unleashed its payload only on the machines it was targeting. And there are attribution issues. Because it's difficult to pinpoint where an attack originates, it gives an attacker plausible deniability. So there are a lot of advantages here that you can conduct an attack and no one will know that it's you. But there are cons to digital warfare. Once you unleash a digital weapon, it's very difficult to control. It's hard to call it back. It's easily duplicated for blowback. When you launch a conventional weapon, your victim can't turn around and pick up the parts of that weapon and send it back to you. But when you launch a digital weapon, you're launching the blueprint that created that weapon. And that means that your victims can study and reverse engineer it the same way that Symantec researchers reverse engineered it and figure out how to design it and send it back to you. Digital weapons also lower the bar of entry for attackers. The average teenager can't create a nuclear weapon or conventional weapon in his backyard, but he can create a digital weapon like this. And it opens the way for countries that don't have the resources to conduct conventional warfare to conduct cyber warfare with very few resources. What it also did, with the US being the country that released this, it legitimized the use of digital weapons as an alternative to using diplomacy. Other nations can look at this now and see this as an opportunity for them to conduct similar attacks rather than engaging in diplomacy over disputes. And it opens up, of course, the door for other attacks, copycat attacks on US systems, which are highly vulnerable to these kinds of attacks. And finally, in unleashing this, the US lost the moral high ground. It can no longer condemn another country for unleashing a digital weapon because it was the first to do so. So let's go back to 2007, when those researchers at INL were asking this question: could an attacker remotely from China, North Korea, or Russia launch nothing but digital code and cause physical destruction? Well, the attack at Idaho National Lab was a proof of concept in theory, but Stuxnet turned out to be the proof of concept showing that it was possible in fact. After Stuxnet was discovered, someone asked General Michael Hayden about this, and Hayden was the head of the CIA and the NSA during the time that Stuxnet was created. And they asked him about Stuxnet, and he said that he thought it was a great idea. But he also said that in unleashing Stuxnet, somebody had crossed the Rubicon. And that somebody, of course, was the US. And where the US went, everyone else will now follow. And that's the end of my talk. I ran over time, sorry. Yeah.
Was there any sort of like public response from like Iran, like sort of, or some sort of like threats of retaliation, or did they do something like tangible as a response to Stuxnet?
So publicly, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad blamed the West and Israel for unleashing it, but there was a problem of embarrassment. They had to downplay it. They said it didn't cause a lot of damage, but they didn't go to the UN. They could have come to the UN to complain, and they didn't file a complaint, and that's partly because they didn't want the embarrassment. The US claims that Iran has retaliated. They claim that there have been a series of DDoS attacks against US banks that lasted, I don't know if they're still ongoing, but they lasted more than a year, and the US claims that Iran unleashed those, but they've offered no proof of attribution.
Other questions?
Yeah.
Has Siemens started implementing some kind of security on their PLCs now because of this?
Say that again?
Has Siemens started implementing any kind of security on their PLCs?
So the vulnerabilities are endless, and once you find one, and patch it, there are going to be other ones. Idaho National Lab actually has a program designed to help vendors examine their industrial control systems for vulnerabilities and patch them. But the industrial control system community is about 10 years behind the rest of the software industry. They're back where Microsoft was in 1999, and they're just now catching up to having internal programs for patching and looking for vulnerabilities. And many of them they don't patch. And some of them can't be patched easily. Some of them it can't be solved with a simple software fix. A lot of them are architecture problems, and they would have to be completely re-architectured.
To what extent are the details of Stuxnet available?
Well, they're in that book.
Okay.
I'm not
You
sure.
mean the code?
Oh, the code. The code was available online. It was made available online. So anyone could have grabbed it. Yeah. It may still be available. It should still be available.
Well, thank you again.